At 3 a.m. on March 9, 1990, 49-year-old Mario Orozco limped homeward through the streets of East New York, a section of Brooklyn known for drugs, violent crime, and poverty. He used a heavy wooden cane as he made his way slowly but surely down the familiar streets. Although he suffered from bad eyesight and a congenital limp, the proud Mr. Orozco worked a tough job in the kitchen of a New York restaurant instead of taking public assistance. The job's late hours required him to ride the subway late at night and walk home on the nearly deserted streets. Unbeknownst to Orozco, a young man in a maroon beret stalked him from the shadows of a nearby cemetery. Without warning, the man emerged from his hiding place and shot Orozco in the back with a 9mm zip gun. Orozco never even saw him. The young man wrapped a note around his gun and laid it carefully on the sidewalk. Then he disappeared. Mr. Orozco was a Scorpio. He survived. At 3 a.m. on March 29, 1990, 34-year-old Jermaine Montenestro wandered the streets of East New York. He was unsure whether to go home to his girlfriend in the Bronx or seek shelter at his father's nearby apartment. The intoxicated man swayed as he walked, smelling strongly of alcohol. Montenestro walked past a high school campus, and a young man watched him from a set of bleachers. As Montenestro made his way slowly forward, the young man began to follow him. He fired a shot. While Montenestro lay bleeding, the young man searched his pockets. He found a wallet but left the money. He took Montenestro's passport and slipped away. Montenestro was a Gemini, and he survived. So begins a bizarre and cryptic letter that arrived at East New York's 17th Precinct on November 17, 1989. Several months before the Orozco and Montenestro shootings, the letter was addressed to Anti-Crime, the elite street crimes unit. The letter contained a large drawn circle with lines divided into sections representing the signs of the zodiac. The sign Virgo was missing, but the Taurus section was marred by the words, "The first sign is dead." The full text read, "This is the zodiac. The first sign is dead. The zodiac will kill the 12 signs in the belt when the zodiacal light is seen. The zodiac will spread fear. I have seen a lot of police in Jamaica Avenue and Eldon Lane, but you are no good and will not get the zodiac. Orion is the one that can stop Zodiac and the seventh sister." The officers checked through open cases to see if the letter was connected to any of them. But after that, they didn't think much about the letter. Hundreds of odd letters arrive at the NYPD each week, and the vast majority of them turn out to be nothing but sad, meaningless pleas for attention. Each is investigated, but the hard truth is that even trained experts sometimes have difficulty determining the writings of a harmless crackpot from that of a violent criminal. If anyone at the department who read the letter noticed its resemblance to the letters of an uncaught serial killer who terrorized the Bay Area in the 1960s and 1970s, he or she did not make a report of it. The Brooklyn police did not connect the Orozco and Montenestro shootings, nor did they ever find the gun that the shooter left beside Orozco. In the chaotic days before New York City's crime turnaround, random acts of violence were all too common, and the detectives had cases they had hopes of solving. They never dreamed that 2 random shootings might be the beginning of the most frightening crime spree the city had seen since the Son of Sam. Joseph Pross liked to walk the streets of East New York and Woodhaven, Queens, late at night. Pross was 78 years old and used a cane. As a young man, he had survived combat in World War II, but now each step was laborious. He was a lonely, elderly man who lived off public assistance, and his short-term memory often failed him. He sometimes rummaged through the trash for discarded food. Woodhaven, where Pross lived, borders East New York and suffers from a similar level of violent crime, drugs, and poverty. Despite warnings by concerned friends, Pross continued his late-night walks because he didn't want to give up one of his few daily pleasures, and he disliked rummaging through trash when neighbors could see him. On May 31, 1990, as Pross made his way home at around 1:30 a.m., a young man approached him and asked for a glass of water. Wary of the stranger, Pross refused and continued on his way, but he moved slowly. The angered young man followed. After a short exchange about the water, the young man pulled out a zip gun and fired a shot into Prose. He placed an eerie handwritten note beside Prose's body and disappeared. Prose was a Taurus, and he died of his wounds on June 24th. Before his death, Queen's detectives interviewed him about the attack. Because Prose was expected to survive, the case was treated as a robbery rather than a homicide. Nevertheless, two detectives, Mike Ciravolo and Bill Clark, were concerned and frightened by the shooter's strange, occultist note. Clark had served on the task force that had caught the son of Sam, and both men suspected this was no ordinary robbery. It was Ciravolo's case, and he quickly compiled a file that was unusually thick for an attempted robbery. The file included faint fingerprints gleaned from the Zodiac's letter. Because the first two incidents happened across the Queens-Brooklyn border, Ciravolo did not know about the similar shootings or the earlier letter that had been sent to the anti-crime unit. Prose himself, who proved to be an awful witness, further hampered the investigation. He changed his story several times, including his description of the assailant. First, Prose claimed the man was African American. Then, he claimed it was possible that he was white, or maybe even Hispanic. The night of the attack was dark. Prose verged on senility and sometimes didn't recognize detectives who had questioned him. The detectives had another witness, a young woman who watched the shooter flee the scene as she trysted her boyfriend. Unfortunately, she and the married boyfriend refused to cooperate with the police for fear of exposing their illicit affair. Then, Prose died. Meanwhile, Ciravolo and Clark's fear that the shooting might be the work of a serial killer started to materialize. Letters similar to the one at the scene of the Prose shooting arrived at the New York Post and 60 Minutes. The Zodiac wrote in the same bizarre style as his earlier notes, listing the time, place, and date of each shooting, along with the victim's astrological sign. The letters said, "All shot in Brooklyn." A reporter at the Post brought the note to the Brooklyn police with the hope that it was genuine. Correspondence from a serial killer can make a career. She was disappointed to discover there had been no murders that fit the note's descriptions. The detectives agreed to continue to investigate, but believed the note to be a fraud. On an unrelated visit to the 17th Precinct, Clark accidentally discovered the investigation into the note. He immediately recognized the connection to the note left nearby his victim and cross-checked the dates and astrological signs to recent murder victims. No results. However, when he cross-checked the dates and astrological signs for shooting victims that hadn't died, he found Orozco and Montenegro. Obviously, the Zodiac didn't realize he had crossed into Queens when he shot Prose. The notes were genuine. Ciravolo called the reporter with the good news. She agreed to let them investigate other possible victims for a few days, but on June 19th, she broke the story. The front-page headline read, "Riddle of the Zodiac Shooter." The Post article put pressure on the police. New Yorkers remembered how the son of Sam used the press to taunt police and frighten citizens. Nobody wanted to avoid the repeat of the son of Sam debacle more than Chief of Detectives Joseph Borelli. He had served on the son of Sam task force, and he had been personally mentioned in one of the son of Sam's letters. He took swift action. He called the detectives from the separate Queens and Brooklyn precincts together for information exchange. When he saw how little the Brooklyn detectives had on the first two shootings, he was livid. Many believed the subsequent dressing down was a bit unfair, given that no notes or reliable witnesses had been found in the Brooklyn cases. But Borelli was in no mood to make concessions. The work of Ciravolo and his detectives impressed Borelli, and he assigned them to the case. Borelli named the effort to catch the Zodiac Operation Watchdog and pledged as much support as necessary. Ciravolo felt confident they would catch the Zodiac quickly. At this time, someone in the 17th Precinct remembered the strange letter that had arrived the previous November. It was added to Ciravolo's case file. Over the next few weeks, the press caught hold of the case and wouldn't let go. New Yorkers began to wonder if the infamous Bay Area Zodiac had returned. Astrologers appeared on television with predictions and explanations. People no longer felt comfortable when asked the question, "What's your sign?" Vigilante groups like the Guardian Angels began patrolling East New York. Operation Watchdog detectives determined a pattern in the Zodiac's actions. They predicted he would strike again on early Thursday morning, June 21st. That night, scores of officers patrolled East New York, both on foot and by car. Unfortunately, they were patrolling in the wrong place. Across the East River in Manhattan, a homeless man named Larry Parham made up his bed on a bench in Central Park. Before he settled down for the night, he hid his wallet in one of his sneakers. As a clean-cut, well-dressed young man with $4,000 in the bank, Parham defied stereotypes. He despised being homeless, but a streak of troubles left him on the street, and he felt he needed to save more money to obtain a solid start. He also felt the park was safer than a shelter. Unbeknownst to Parham, a young man watched him from a nearby bench. As Parham slept, the young man crept over to his bench and carefully removed his wallet. He examined the contents of the wallet, but left the $49 in cash untouched. He returned the wallet, stood up, and fired a shot. Parham was a Cancer, and he survived the shooting. An intriguing Zodiac letter arrived at the Post the day after the Central Park shooting. It contained the same occult symbolism, nonsensical ramblings, and a listing of the victims, time of death, and sun sign. This letter, however, was unusual in its vehement attempt to convince the Post, and thus the police and public, that the New York Zodiac was the same person as the Bay Area Zodiac. Aside from a few enthusiastic exceptions, the police, press, and public never really believed the two were the same. Everything from the killer's handwriting to the victim's descriptions of the assailant pointed to the fact that New York Zodiac was a copycat. The Zodiac's June 22nd note, however, vehemently denied it. This is the Zodiac. The note sent to the Post, not to any of the San Francisco Zodiac letters. You are wrong. The handwriting looked different. It is one of the same Zodiac. One Zodiac in San Francisco killed a man in the park with a gun and killed a woman with a knife and killed a man in a taxicab with gun. As journalist Kieran Crowley wrote in Sleep My Little Dead, many reporters salivated at the idea that the original Zodiac had returned. After all, it would have made an explosive story. However, the June 22nd note struck Crowley and his colleagues as just too desperate and angry. It was the work of a young, non-white man from Brooklyn who wanted everyone to believe that he was a white, middle-aged serial killer from San Francisco. Nevertheless, the fact that New York Zodiac was a copycat didn't change the fact that Joseph Prost died on June 24th. New York Zodiac was officially a killer, and the NYPD mobilized to stop him. Parham helped the police put together a composite sketch. He described his assailant as black, around 30 years old, 5 foot 10 inches to 6 feet tall, and about 185 pounds. Wags nicknamed the composite sketch Evil Al Roker for its resemblance to the jovial TV weatherman. The composite was released to the press, prompting hundreds of calls. Publicity-hungry psychics offered to help the police solve the case. People reported friends, neighbors, co-workers that had to be the Zodiac. One young man was fingerprinted because he took a book on astrology out of the New York Public Library. Another man was arrested and questioned because, in 1980, he had signed a friend's yearbook with a quote from a San Francisco Zodiac's letter. Police consulted astronomy professors for insights on the constellations. Through all this, detectives began to believe the only way to catch the Zodiac was to trap him in the act. After all, they knew when he would strike next. 22-year-old Heriberto Seda lived with his mother and half-sister in East New York. He was clean-cut, handsome, and kept his room spotless. He didn't work, had no friends, and had dropped out of high school at 16 after being suspended for carrying a weapon. Seda took no public assistance the way his mother did. He obtained money by shoving plastic bags up the return slots of payphones and vending machines. After a few days, he would return and remove the bag and the lodged change. Seda didn't date girls. He was deeply religious and devoted his life to God. He attended church regularly, which made his mother proud. Seda and his school-aged sister, Gladys Chachi Reyes, didn't get along. Reyes had a personality in direct opposition to her brothers. She was outgoing, personable, and had many friends in the neighborhood. When she was a small child, Seda doted on her. She went to school with bruises and teachers sent social workers to check on her. Around 1989, Seda stopped hurting Chachi. The two still didn't get along, but Seda no longer beat her regularly. He stayed in his room most of the time and pursued his hobbies. Seda loved to read, particularly about guns and violence. He liked magazines like Soldier Fortune and books on serial killers. He idolized Ted Bundy, who in addition to being a murderer, was also a clean-cut man and a good citizen who did volunteer work. But the killer Seda most admired was the Bay Area's Zodiac. He was a mystery because he'd never been caught. He was smarter than the cops. Movies like Dirty Harry had been made about him. He was a servant of God, and his sinner victims would serve him in the afterlife. One of the many books on that subject which sat on Eddie Seda's shelf was a well-worn copy of Robert Graysmith's Zodiac. Considered by many to be the definitive book on the original Zodiac case, it provided the blueprint for Seda's carefully constructed identity. He was the new Zodiac. Since the press coverage began after the Prost killing, Seda had lovingly compiled a scrapbook of the New York Zodiac case. He proudly kept that scrapbook next to the ones he had earlier compiled on Ted Bundy, the Zodiac, and other famous serial killers. He had a small arsenal of homemade guns and explosives. He ordered ammunition from catalogs, but he crafted a collection of zip guns himself. He knew that with the zip guns, he could change barrels and thus avoid a ballistics match. He would not be caught. Not only because he was smart, but because he believed the magic was on his side. Yet he feared the magic was wearing off. The police had his fingerprints. If he was arrested for anything at all, the police would know he was the Zodiac. Seda was scared, but he had a course of action. He would stop killing. The San Francisco Zodiac stopped. Seda decided he would stop as well. That way, they would never catch him. When the Operation Watchdog mobilized for an August Zodiac attack, nothing happened. Soon, the Zodiac task force was reduced from 50 cops to 18. In a few months, people calmed down and the city stopped worrying about the Zodiac. Since Prost had died and there was no statute of limitations on murder, Ciravolo and other detectives pursued the Zodiac when they had time, but the case was no longer a top priority. Seda waited a year. He thumbed through his scrapbook and visited the scenes of the first 4 shootings. It wasn't enough. He knew it was time for the Zodiac to return. This time, however, Seda knew he must make some changes in his style. The police knew he liked Thursday mornings, so he couldn't shoot on Thursdays. He also couldn't risk searching the victims for identification in order to determine his or her astrological sign. This time around, he would just shoot and run. On August 10, 1992, 39-year-old Patricia Fonte met a good-looking man near the Highland Park Reservoir. After some flirtatious banter, she agreed to accompany him to the shore of the reservoir. At 1:30 a.m., he shot her with a .22 caliber zip gun, but she got up and struggled with him. In a panic, the Zodiac stabbed her over 100 times. She died on the scene. She was a Leo. On June 4, 1992, 40-year-old unemployed construction worker Jim Weber encountered a young man outside Highland Park at about midnight. The young man shot him in the buttocks. He is a Libra, and he survived. On July 20, 1992, the young man shot 40-year-old mental patient Joseph Diacon outside of Highland Park at 11:35 a.m. He was a Virgo, and he died. On October 2, 1992, the young man shot 40-year-old Diane Ballard as she sat on a bench in Highland Park. She is a Taurus and survived the attack. The police didn't connect these crimes. In a city that, at that time, averaged 5 murders a night, detectives found nothing to connect them. On March 10, 1994, police arrested Heriberto Eddie Seda outside his East New York apartment building after finding him in possession of an illegal zip gun. He was polite and cooperated fully with officers. The gun was incorrectly labeled at the evidence lab, so it was never tested. Seda walked free a week later. On June 10, 1994, the Zodiac shot a white man in Highland Park with a .22 caliber zip gun. the incident went unreported. On August 1, 1994, the Post received the most bizarre Zodiac letter yet. It contained a list of the new victims, a strange totem pole code, and the creepy line, "Sleep, my little dead, how we loathe them." The Zodiac mailed it using a love stamp. The press ran the story, and the city fell back into a panic. The new Zodiac letter baffled police. Was it a copycat of a copycat? Or was the original copycat back? Police didn't know, and were sadly certain he would strike again before they found out. Seda and his 17-year-old sister were at odds constantly, especially since he had started ratting on the local drug dealers. Reyes often socialized with the young dealers in the neighborhood, and she told her brother to keep his nose out of her friend's business. Seda wanted her to stay away from the young men. Reyes, who brought home the household's only earned paycheck, thought her freeloading, ratting brother had no right to tell her what to do. She warned him that the dealers were going to come and get him. The two often screamed at each other. Seda went over the edge on June 18, 1996. Reyes invited a young male friend over to the apartment. As he listened to the pair socialize in the girl's bedroom, Seda boiled over with rage. He knew the unsavory young man to be a dealer and couldn't stand the idea of his sister consorting with him. He pounded on the wall that he shared with her bedroom. Reyes knew that meant her brother wanted her guest out of the house. She had always obeyed him in the past, but she was angry about his snitching and fed up with financially supporting him. She ignored him. An infuriated Seda took one of his zip guns and fired it into the wall. Reyes screamed for him to stop. The brother and sister confronted each other in the living room as Seda brandished a weapon. Seda shot her in the back as she tried to escape through the front door. The gunshot did not incapacitate her, and she made it out the door into a neighbor's apartment. The frightened neighbor bolted the door and did her best to help the wounded girl. She called 911. Meanwhile, Reyes' friend locked himself in her bedroom and cowered. The ambulance arrived first. The neighbor let 2 EMTs into her apartment, and soon the 4 of them were trapped in the apartment as Seda fired shots out the window at police. 17 officers gathered in front of the apartment building. After several hours, Detective Joey Herbert of the 17th Precinct managed to talk Seda into giving himself up. When officers saw some of the zip guns he turned over to them, they joked that it would be a pisser if this were the Z-Man. In keeping with the procedure, detectives asked Seda to write his confession. He obliged, with poor grammar and spelling. At the end of the confession, he drew the cross that he included on each of the Zodiac letters and 3 sevens. Detective Danny Powers recognized the cross. He went to Detective Herbert and some other colleagues for confirmation of his suspicion. They all agreed. Seda was the Zodiac. They quickly got major case prints from Seda. Major case prints were sets of fingerprints that included the palm and sides of the fingers, in addition to the fingertips. With sirens blazing, Detective Tommy Maher transported the prints to Police Plaza for cross-checking with the Zodiac's prints. Meanwhile, another detective, Louis Savarese, went home to retrieve some Zodiac letters that he kept there. He had been obsessed with tracking the Zodiac and worked on the case in his spare time. As Savarese and Herbert began the long process of questioning Seda, the prints came back a match. As the news spread through the department, Savarese and Herbert pushed hard. Maher, who had returned from Police Plaza, played the good cop. He consoled Seda and told him that he needed to cleanse his soul. They showed Seda crime scene photos, and for the first time he saw the results of his missions. He saw death close up. They questioned him about every detail of the case. He became confused, tired, and angry. He told his story in all its detail. Then he asked about his sister. In June of 1998, a jury convicted Heriberto Eddie Seda of being the New York City Zodiac killer. His sentence determined that he must serve 83.5 years before becoming eligible for parole. In a separate trial, he was convicted of the attempted murders and sentenced to 152.5 years. Having been born in the late 1960s, he obviously had nothing to do with the original San Francisco crimes. Today, Seda resides in prison where he reads the Bible daily and quotes scripture to his fellow inmates. After being arrested, he made several attempts to reconcile with his sister. Gladys Chachi Reyes refused her brother's calls. Most of the Zodiac's living victims suffered physically and psychologically from the attacks. Some, like devoutly Christian Parham, have forgiven Seda for what he did. Others, like Montenegro, refused to discuss the case. Orozco stayed in East New York and did not let fear stop him from walking the streets or enjoying the company of friends. The original Zodiac was never caught. He remains a mystery.